September 14, 1945. 3 weeks after the formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the war in the Pacific had officially ended. Across America, families welcomed home their sons and husbands, while prisoners of war camps prepared to process thousands of Japanese soldiers for repatriation. But in a modest facility outside Fresno, California, something extraordinary was happening that morning. When Corporal Arthur Dennison wheeled a cart of freshly baked white bread into the mess hall, where 43 Japanese women prisoners sat in rigid silence, none of them moved. They simply stared. Then, almost simultaneously, they inhaled. The aroma that filled that room would become the catalyst for one of the most unexpected transformations in the history of American prisoner of war operations. These weren't hardened soldiers. They were members of the Japanese Women's Volunteer Corps, young women aged 18 to 32, who had served the empire in various capacities throughout the Pacific Theater. They had been captured during the final chaotic weeks of the war, transported across an ocean to a country they had been taught to fear and hate, and were now sitting in an American military facility, waiting for whatever fate their captors had planned for them. Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women and how a simple loaf of bread changed everything they believed about their enemies, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Reiko Fujimoto sat at the far end of the third table, her back straight, despite 3 days of minimal sleep during transport. At 24 years old, she had served as a radio operator in Manila, intercepting American communications and translating them for Japanese commanders. She had been good at her work, proud of her contribution to the empire's defense. Now she was prisoner number 107 in a foreign land, wearing a gray cotton dress that replaced her uniform and trying not to show the fear that had been her constant companion since capture. When the American corporal, a thin man with kind eyes and flour still dusting his forearms, began placing thick slices of white bread on plates in front of each woman, Reiko felt her carefully maintained composure crack slightly. The bread was impossibly white, soft, and still warm from the oven. Steam rose from each slice like morning mist over rice fields. The aroma was unlike anything she had experienced in the past 2 years of war. It smelled of abundance, of care, of a world that still had enough of everything to waste flour on making something beautiful. Her propaganda training had prepared her for torture, for interrogation, for systematic cruelty. No one had prepared her for this. Beside her, Keiko Ishikawa, a former nurse from Osaka, whispered in Japanese so quietly that only Reiko could hear. "They're going to poison us. This is how they'll do it. Make it smell good so we'll eat without question." But even as Keiko spoke those words, her eyes betrayed her. She was staring at the bread with the same confused hunger that Reiko felt. Around them, 41 other women sat frozen in the same state of disbelief, inhaling an aroma that contradicted everything they thought they knew about their captors. The story of how these 43 women came to be sitting in an American prison camp began 18 months earlier, in March of 1944, when the Japanese Empire issued a desperate call for volunteers. The war was turning against Japan, and the military needed women to fill support roles so that every able-bodied man could be sent to the front lines. Reiko had been 22 years old, working as a translator at a publishing house in Tokyo, when the recruitment officers came to her workplace. They wore crisp uniforms and spoke with the absolute certainty of people who believed they were on the right side of history. They told the assembled women that serving the empire was the highest honor a Japanese woman could achieve, that their contributions would be remembered for generations, and that the alternative, allowing the barbaric Americans to invade their homeland, was unthinkable. The propaganda had been thorough and unrelenting. From childhood, Reiko and her generation had been taught that Americans were demons in human form, that they tortured prisoners for entertainment, that they raped and murdered without conscience, and that capture meant a fate worse than death. These weren't abstract warnings. They were presented as established facts. Supported by carefully selected photographs and testimonies from sources the women had no reason to question, Reiko volunteered because she believed she was defending her family, her culture, and everything she held sacred. Keiko Ishikawa had joined for similar reasons. As a trained nurse, she had skills the military desperately needed. She was assigned to a field hospital in the Philippines where she treated wounded Japanese soldiers and saw firsthand the brutality of modern warfare. The suffering she witnessed only reinforced what she had been taught about the enemy. Americans did this, her commanders told her, as she bandaged men who would never walk again. Americans are responsible for all of this pain. Tomoko Hayashi, at 19 the youngest of their group, had been a communications clerk in Saipan. She had never wanted to join the military, but her father, a retired Army officer, had insisted it was her duty. She remembered crying the night before she left home and her mother holding her, whispering that she must be brave for Japan. Noriko Matsuda had worked in supply logistics, and Akiko Kimura had been a decoder working alongside Reiko in the communications unit. Each woman had her own story, her own reasons for serving, but they all shared one thing in common. They had believed completely in what they were doing. The capture had been chaotic and terrifying. As American forces advanced through the Philippines in the summer of 1945, Japanese military operations collapsed into confusion. The women's unit had been evacuated from Manila, but their transport convoy was intercepted by American troops near Batangas. Reiko remembered the moment American soldiers appeared on the road, their weapons raised, shouting commands in English that none of the women fully understood. She had closed her eyes and waited for death. It never came. Instead, they were separated from male prisoners, processed with surprising efficiency, and eventually transported by ship across the Pacific. The journey took 3 weeks, during which the women were kept in a cargo hold, converted into temporary housing. They spoke little during those weeks, each woman lost in her own fear about what awaited them in America. Everything they had been taught told them that their suffering had only just begun. The transport truck carrying the 43 Japanese women arrived at the Fresno facility just before dawn on September 10, 1945. Through the canvas covering, Reiko could see the first light breaking over flat California farmland that reminded her painfully of home. The landscape was so ordinary, so peaceful, that it seemed impossible this was enemy territory. When the truck stopped and American soldiers ordered them out in broken Japanese, the women moved as one unit, maintaining the discipline that had been drilled into them. They formed neat rows in the dusty courtyard, their faces carefully blank, revealing nothing of the terror each woman felt. Captain Helen Thornton stood waiting for them, a tall woman with gray beginning to show in her brown hair. She wore her uniform with the kind of casual authority that came from years of military service, but her expression was neither cruel nor cold. It was professional, almost businesslike, which somehow made everything more confusing. Through an interpreter, Captain Thornton explained the camp rules. The women would be housed in converted barracks. They would receive 3 meals daily. They would have access to medical care. They would be allowed to write letters home through the International Red Cross. They would not be harmed. Reiko listened to these words with deep suspicion. This had to be a trick, a psychological tactic designed to lower their defenses before the real brutality began. Beside her, she could feel the other women thinking the same thing. No army treated captured enemies with such consideration. It violated everything they understood about war and capture. The barracks they were led to was simple but clean, with rows of metal cots covered in folded blankets. There were windows that actually opened, allowing fresh air to circulate. There was a separate washing facility with running water. The space was sparse but maintained with care, nothing like the dark cells or cages they had been told to expect. As the women settled into their assigned bunks, a strange silence filled the room. They had prepared themselves for immediate interrogation, for violence, for humiliation. Instead, they had been given blankets and told that lunch would be served at noon. The psychological dissonance was almost worse than physical abuse would have been. At least pain they could understand. Keiko finally broke the silence, speaking in rapid Japanese. "This is how they break us. They make us comfortable, make us trust them, and then they use that trust against us. We must remain vigilant. We must remember who we are and who they are." The other women murmured agreement, but Reiko noticed that several of them were already touching their blankets, testing the mattresses, allowing themselves small moments of relief despite their determination to stay guarded. That first morning stretched into afternoon, and still no interrogators came. No guards entered to drag them away. Instead, at precisely noon, they were escorted to a mess hall where the first meal of their captivity waited. None of them could have imagined what that meal would mean, or how a simple piece of bread would begin to unravel everything they believed about their captors. The mess hall was a long, rectangular building with high windows that let in afternoon sunlight. Tables were arranged in neat rows, each set with metal plates, cups, and utensils that gleamed despite their military simplicity. The 43 women filed in silently, taking their seats as they had been instructed, every movement careful and controlled. Captain Thornton stood at the front of the room alongside Corporal Arthur Dennison, who waited beside a wheeled cart covered with a clean white cloth. When the captain nodded, Dennison pulled back the cloth to reveal stacks of sliced white bread, each piece perfectly uniform, still steaming slightly in the cool air of the hall. The reaction was immediate and involuntary. Every woman in the room inhaled sharply, drawing in the scent of fresh-baked bread that filled the space like an invisible presence. Reiko felt her stomach clench with sudden hunger that had nothing to do with mere physical need. The aroma carried with it memories of better times, of her mother's kitchen, of days before war had consumed everything. But this bread was different from anything she had known in Japan. It was impossibly white, soft as cotton, and the smell spoke of abundance that seemed obscene in a world where she had watched people starve. Dennison began moving between the tables, placing 2 thick slices on each woman's plate with movements that were almost gentle. He smiled at each prisoner as he served them, a genuine expression that created more confusion than comfort. Reiko stared at the bread on her plate as if it might vanish if she looked away. The texture was unlike the dense rice cakes or hard military rations she had eaten for months. This bread looked like clouds given substance, like something too delicate to exist in the harsh reality of war and captivity. Beside her, Tomoko reached out slowly and touched the bread with one finger, then pulled back as if it had burned her. The bread compressed slightly under her touch, then slowly expanded back to its original shape. She looked at Reiko with wide eyes that asked a question neither of them could answer. Why would their captors give them something so fine? Around the room, other women were having similar reactions. Noriko held a slice close to her face, breathing in the scent with an expression of painful longing. Akiko simply stared at her plate, tears running silently down her cheeks for reasons she probably could not have explained. No one ate. They all waited, watching each other, watching the Americans, trying to understand what this moment meant. Captain Thornton observed them with an expression that might have been sadness or perhaps understanding. She said something in English to the interpreter, who translated. "The bread is not poisoned. You may eat freely. This is your meal, given without condition or expectation." Still, no one moved. The bread sat on 43 plates, cooling slowly, while 43 women struggled to reconcile the evidence before them with everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Reiko made a decision that would change everything. Reiko picked up the slice of bread with both hands, feeling its warmth against her palms. She could feel every eye in the room on her, 42 women, watching to see if she would be the first to trust or the first to fall into whatever trap this might be. She brought the bread to her lips and took a small bite. The texture was extraordinary, soft and yielding, almost sweet. It dissolved on her tongue like something precious, like something that should not exist in a world at war. She chewed slowly, waiting for some terrible consequence that never came. Within moments, the sound of 42 other women taking their first bites filled the hall with a strange music. Some ate slowly like Reiko, savoring each small piece. Others devoured their slices with the desperation of people who had forgotten what real food tasted like. Keiko ate her bread with tears streaming down her face, though she made no sound. When the meal ended, Corporal Dennison returned with his cart, but this time he carried something else. From a wooden crate, he produced small packages wrapped in brown paper. Through the interpreter, he explained that these were care packages, basic toiletries that each woman would receive: soap, toothbrushes, combs, and small towels. Items so ordinary they should have meant nothing, yet in that moment, they meant everything. Sergeant Raymond Callahan, who had been standing guard near the door, approached the tables where the women sat. He was a stocky man in his 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested he had worked hard his entire life. He carried a notebook and began attempting to learn the women's names, pointing to himself and saying "Ray" slowly, then gesturing to each woman in turn. Most remained silent, but Tomoko, perhaps emboldened by the bread, whispered her name. Callahan repeated it carefully, his pronunciation clumsy but his effort genuine. He wrote it down in his notebook with serious concentration, as if learning her name was important work that deserved his full attention. Over the following days, these small gestures multiplied. Private George Tanaka, a Japanese-American soldier from California, became an unofficial bridge between the two groups. His Japanese was rusty, learned from grandparents rather than schools, but it was enough. He translated not just words but intentions, helping the American staff understand that these women were terrified and helping the women understand that their captors had no intention of harming them. When Noriko developed a fever 3 days after their arrival, Dr. Margaret Ashford treated her with the same care she would have shown any patient. She brought medicine, checked her temperature regularly, and sat beside her bed speaking softly, even though Noriko could not understand the words. The tone was enough. It was the tone a mother uses with a sick child, universal and unmistakable. Each small kindness created a tiny crack in the wall the women had built around themselves. The bread had been the first crack, but these accumulated gestures of basic human decency were slowly making that wall impossible to maintain. Reiko found herself watching the Americans with new confusion, trying to reconcile their actions with everything she had been taught. 3 weeks into their captivity, the cognitive dissonance had become unbearable. Reiko lay awake at night on her cot, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of two incompatible realities. Everything her training had taught her said that Americans were brutal, savage, incapable of mercy. Yet every day brought new evidence that contradicted those teachings. The bread kept coming, fresh every morning, sometimes with butter, sometimes with jam, made from local fruits. Corporal Dennison took pride in his baking, and the women had learned to recognize the different types he made: white bread, wheat bread, and on Sundays, something sweet he called cinnamon rolls, that filled the entire camp with an aroma that seemed to promise that good things were still possible in the world. During the day, the women were allowed to walk in a small courtyard. There were guards, yes, but they stood at a distance, watching without menace. Sergeant Callahan had started bringing a baseball and glove, tossing the ball against the barracks wall during his shifts. Sometimes he would gesture to the women, inviting them to try. Most refused out of pride or fear, but Akiko had finally accepted, and her first clumsy catch had made Callahan laugh with such genuine delight that even the most suspicious women had to smile. The letters they were permitted to write through the Red Cross created another kind of crisis. What could they say to their families? How could they explain that their captors fed them better than the Japanese military had in the final months of the war? How could they admit that they were being treated with a dignity that contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had promised? Keiko struggled with her letter for days before finally writing only the most basic information. She was alive, she was unharmed, she hoped her family had survived. She could not bring herself to mention the bread or the kindness or the terrible confusion that kept her awake at night, questioning everything she had believed. Private Tanaka became their most frequent visitor, checking on them daily with questions about their needs. His presence was particularly complicated. Here was a man of Japanese ancestry who had chosen to wear an American uniform, who spoke their language but served their enemies. The women did not know what to make of him. One afternoon, Tomoko gathered the courage to ask him directly in Japanese why he had chosen America over Japan. Tanaka was quiet for a long moment before answering. His grandparents had come to California 40 years ago, seeking opportunity. He had been born in Sacramento, had grown up playing baseball and attending American schools. When the war started, his family had been sent to an internment camp, their loyalty questioned simply because of their ancestry. Yet despite that injustice, he had volunteered to serve because he believed in American ideals, even when America failed to live up to them. His answer created more questions than it resolved. If America imprisoned its own citizens for their Japanese blood, how could it be better than Japan? Yet here he stood, wearing the uniform by choice, treating them with respect that transcended national loyalty. October brought the first responses to the letters the women had sent through the Red Cross, or rather, it brought the terrible absence of responses. Reiko had written to her parents in Tokyo, to her younger sister, to the aunt who had raised her after her mother died. She had sent 3 letters over 4 weeks, each one carefully composed to reveal nothing that might worry them while still expressing her desperate need to know they were alive. No replies came. She was not alone in this silence. Of the 43 women in the camp, only 7 received any word from home. The news those 7 letters contained was devastating. Keiko learned that her parents' home in Osaka had been destroyed in the firebombing of March 13, 1945. Her father was dead. Her mother and younger brother had survived and were living with relatives in the countryside. The letter was brief, factual, empty of emotion, because there was too much emotion to contain in mere words. Noriko's letter brought even worse news. Her entire family, everyone she had known in Hiroshima, was simply gone. The letter came not from relatives, but from a government official who listed her as next of kin for identification purposes. The atomic bomb dropped on August 6th had left nothing behind but shadows and silence. She did not cry when she read the letter. She simply folded it carefully, placed it under her pillow, and stopped speaking. For 3 days, Noriko said nothing to anyone, eating her meals mechanically, staring at nothing, existing in a space beyond grief. Dr. Ashford tried to help, sitting with her, offering what comfort she could through the language barrier. Finally, it was the bread that brought Noriko back. On the 3rd morning of her silence, Corporal Dennison placed a cinnamon roll on her plate, still warm, the sweet glaze catching the morning light. Noriko looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up with trembling hands. She took a bite, and the tears finally came. She wept into her hands while Reiko held her, while Keiko and Tomoko gathered around, offering the only comfort they could, the solidarity of shared loss. The women who received no letters at all faced a different kind of torture. Not knowing was somehow worse than terrible news. Reiko found herself trapped between hope and despair, imagining her family alive and well one moment, then imagining them buried in the rubble of Tokyo the next. Captain Thornton arranged for additional letters to be sent, using every channel available through military and Red Cross networks. She spent hours in her office writing requests, making telephone calls, doing everything in her power to help these women find their families. Her dedication was puzzling. Why would an American officer work so hard for enemy prisoners? Private Tanaka tried to explain it one afternoon when he found Reiko sitting alone in the courtyard. Captain Thornton lost her own son in the Pacific, he said quietly. She knows what it means to wait for news that never comes. She would not wish that pain on anyone, not even her enemies. November brought a shift in the camp's atmosphere. The women had been captives for 2 months, and the rigid boundaries between prisoner and captor had begun to blur in ways none of them had anticipated. It started when Corporal Dennison's regular baker fell ill with pneumonia, leaving him short-handed in the kitchen. Through Private Tanaka, he asked if any of the women knew how to bake. The request was met with suspicious silence until Akiko, who had worked in her family's shop in Yokohama, tentatively raised her hand. What began as a practical arrangement became something more profound. Akiko spent her first morning in the kitchen watching Dennison work, observing his techniques with the focused attention she had once given to decoding enemy communications. He showed her how to measure flour, how to knead dough until it reached the perfect consistency, how to judge when the oven temperature was right. By the 3rd day, she was baking alongside him, her hands working the dough with growing confidence. The bread she produced was different from Dennison's, shaped by techniques learned in a Japanese kitchen but adapted to American ingredients. When the other women tasted it, they found something remarkable. It was neither purely Japanese nor purely American, but something new, something that belonged to both worlds and to neither. Reiko had found her own path forward through language. Her English had improved dramatically through daily conversations with Private Tanaka and Sergeant Callahan. Captain Thornton noticed her aptitude and asked if she would be willing to help translate for the other women during medical appointments and administrative procedures. The work gave Reiko purpose beyond simply waiting for news that might never come. She discovered that she had a talent for bridging not just languages but understanding, helping Dr. Ashford understand when a woman's silence meant pain rather than stubbornness, helping the women understand when an American's directness was efficiency rather than rudeness. Tomoko had begun teaching origami to some of the younger American guards. Using scraps of paper from the camp office, she folded cranes, flowers, and geometric shapes that seemed to defy the limitations of their simple material. The guards were fascinated, their large hands clumsy at first, but gradually learning the precise folds required. One afternoon, she taught Sergeant Callahan how to fold a crane. He worked at it for an hour, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, until finally he held up a slightly lopsided but recognizable bird. His pride in that small paper crane was so genuine that Tomoko found herself smiling for the first time since capture. These activities created a new dynamic in the camp. The women were no longer simply prisoners marking time until repatriation. They were becoming participants in a small community, contributing their skills, learning new ones, building connections that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. When Mrs. Dorothy Sinclair, a local teacher, came to the camp offering to teach English classes, 12 women volunteered immediately. They sat in a converted storage room 3 afternoons a week, practicing pronunciation and grammar with the same dedication they had once given to serving the Empire. December 7, 1945. 4 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, Captain Thornton called a General Assembly for all the women. The date's significance was not lost on anyone. Reiko filed into the mess hall with the others, her stomach tight with anxiety about what this announcement might mean. Captain Thornton stood at the front of the room with official documents in her hands, her expression serious but not unkind. Private Tanaka stood beside her, ready to translate. The news was both expected and devastating. Repatriation procedures had been finalized. Transportation would be arranged for the first week of January. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Japan before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. They had 4 weeks to prepare. The silence that followed the announcement was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke. Each woman was lost in her own calculation of what this news meant for her future. Reiko thought of Tokyo, of streets she had walked as a child, of a home that might no longer exist. She thought of her family, whom she had not heard from despite months of letters. She thought of returning to a Japan that had been utterly defeated, where she would be just another displaced person trying to survive in the ruins. Then she thought of the bread, of the English lessons, of the translation work that made her feel useful. She thought of Sergeant Callahan's clumsy kindness and Dr. Ashford's gentle care and Corporal Dennison's pride when they praised his baking. She thought of how she had stopped flinching when Americans approached, how she had started to see them as individuals rather than enemies. What was she returning to, and what would she be leaving behind? That evening, the women gathered in their barracks for a conversation that lasted deep into the night. They spoke in rapid Japanese, their voices rising and falling with emotion as they wrestled with the impossible choice before them. Some, like Keiko, felt a deep duty to return. Japan would need people to rebuild, to help create something better from the ashes. Her mother and brother were alive and needed her. How could she abandon them for her own comfort? Others, like Noriko, had nothing to return to. Everyone she had loved was dead. Japan held only ghosts and grief. Here in America, she had found a fragile peace, a way to keep living despite her loss. Returning felt like choosing to drown when someone had thrown her a rope. Akiko spoke of her time in the kitchen, of how baking bread had given her something she had not felt in years, joy in simple work, pride in creation, rather than destruction. Could she find that again in Japan? Would she even want to? Reiko listened to all of them, understanding each perspective because she felt all of them simultaneously. She wanted to go home, and she wanted to stay. She wanted to honor her duty to Japan, and she wanted to honor the person she was becoming in America. 25 years later, on a crisp autumn morning in 1970, Reiko Fujimoto stood in the kitchen of her small home in Fresno, California, preparing bread using the techniques Corporal Arthur Dennison had taught her a quarter-century earlier. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, kneading the dough with the perfect rhythm she had mastered over thousands of repetitions. On the counter beside her sat a faded photograph from January 1946, showing 43 Japanese women standing in front of their barracks on their final day at the camp. In the end, 16 women had chosen to return to Japan immediately. They had boarded trucks bound for San Francisco with dignity and determination, carrying letters from their American guards and memories that would shape the rest of their lives. Several had become leaders in Japanese-American reconciliation efforts, working to build bridges between former enemies. Keiko had returned to her mother and brother, eventually becoming a nurse in a hospital funded by American aid. She wrote to Reiko twice a year, her letters filled with gratitude for the second chance both nations had been given. 27 women, including Reiko, had made the unprecedented choice to remain. Through sponsorships arranged by Captain Thornton, Mrs. Sinclair, and others who had witnessed their transformation, they had been reclassified as displaced persons and processed for immigration. The journey from enemy prisoner to American resident had been complex and often painful, but it had been their choice. Reiko had found work as a translator, first for the military, then for the State Department, helping to process the thousands of displaced persons arriving from Asia. Her facility with languages and her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the conflict made her invaluable. She had married an American veteran, had raised 2 children who knew both cultures, and had built a life that honored both her Japanese heritage and her American present. Noriko had never left Fresno. She worked at the local library, a quiet woman who found solace in books and in the community that had accepted her. Akiko had opened a small bakery that served both American and Japanese pastries, creating fusion recipes that delighted customers from both cultures. Tomoko taught art at the local high school, sharing origami and traditional Japanese crafts with generations of American students. That morning, as Reiko shaped the dough into loaves, she thought about the moment that had changed everything, The aroma of fresh bread filling a mess hall, 43 frightened women inhaling simultaneously their first taste of American kindness. Such a simple thing, bread. Just flour and water and yeast and heat. Yet it had been enough to crack open their certainty, to create space for doubt, then understanding, then transformation. She slid the loaves into the oven and sat down to write her weekly letter to Keiko. Outside her window, the California sun rose over farmland that still reminded her of home. Though now she had two homes, two languages, two cultures that lived together in her heart, like ingredients in bread, separate but inseparable, creating something new and nourishing from their combination.